Now, some of these rifles for some essay, we've got the Springfield's Model 1861 percussion-fired rifle musket here at the top. The CS Richmond rifle musket, you can see how they look and they perform very similarly. We've got the 1843 Hall carbine, so you can see these are much smaller, much lighter. There is the breech loading mechanism. We've got the Spencer carbine. This is a repeater action rifle. And we've got the British Whitworth rifle, just as an example to show. And down here at the bottom, we've got our original lead projectiles that were again slugged out of the muzzles of muskets. And then we have what's called the Mighty Ball, which is the development of a projectile that is aerodynamic, that actually travels through the atmosphere with some ballistic properties to it. And then we've got our first evolutions of a projectile with a cartridge attached to it. This has its own propellant. This has its own headspace that allows a seal in the chamber. And these are very technological advances, and the Union at the time is just light years ahead of the Confederates in terms of these implementations of firearms. Next, we have capabilities and limitations. So now that we know the basic equipment that is put in place for the Confederates and for the Union, we can look at some limitations and capabilities that we can predict or apply to each of the factions. On the northern side, we've got an industrial advantage. So once again, these mass productions of firearms, of clothing, of logistics to the Union soldiers is a very big, strong, or a very strong characteristic of the Union. We've got naval superiority, in which the Confederates are pretty bogged down into their own terrain. And we've got structured and specialized units, as opposed to the Confederate side, which are not very structured. However, they do have strong leadership. We've got a larger population and a large enlistment rate coming from the Union as opposed to the Confederacy. One of the strongest limitations that the Union faced was having to decisively engage in an offensive attack against a defensive unit. Now, a defensive unit is always going to have the advantage, especially if arms are evenly matched. On the Southern Confederacy side, we've got capabilities that coincide with the limitations of the Union. We've got defensive posture. We've got stronger incentives and morale. These Southern soldiers and the Southern population have their own swagger to them, and they have their own, they're protecting their way of life as opposed to the Union. They're enlisting for this fight. And of course, we have got some strong military leader experience from the prior conflicts and from Western expansion. On the Southern side. Again, one of the biggest aspects is the reactive arms race that the South is in against the North. You always want to be proactive in your actions, especially in a conflict against another force. Being reactive puts you at a disadvantage 9 times out of 10, no matter what the case is. Some fire and maneuver concepts. This is what we were preluding to in the minutes prior. So fire and maneuver is a technique of advance in which one element, the maneuver element, moves while being supported by another element, and a separate and distinct mission is assigned to each one of these elements. Now, once again, these are the concepts of a main effort and a supporting effort. These main efforts and supporting efforts can bridge the gap between each other and they can become vice versa. However, this concept of fire and maneuver is on a small scale, and it's also on a very large scale, just like what we see with these large-scale battles on the Union and Confederate sides, where a main force will be fighting an attack. The supporting force will come up and feint for that main effort. The main effort will then flank to the opposite side of another force. These are very advanced combat techniques, and they're things that are learned and that are experimented with at this time, and things that are remembered for years to come. So during the Civil War, we see the evolution of the fire maneuver concepts, and infantry lines are supported by cavalry scouts, precision shooting, artillery, and naval superiority aided in attrition warfare. So all of these things come together in order to allow the Union to fight against the Confederates at this time. So we've got some notable battles. Now, these are just a few of them. There are a lot. However, these are the ones that I chose. We've got the first Bull Run in 1861. This is the first example of decisive combat that the South and the North are pit up against each other. And we see a victory from the South, and this is likely due to the military leadership. Now the North begins to gain a name for themselves as ones who retreat from combat, especially when overwhelmed. So this is a bad battle tactic for the North, and it becomes a bad habit. Then we have the Peninsular Campaign in 1862. Now, this is a 7-day battle that involves a lot of elements of combat, and this is a campaign led to that has led to another win from the Confederacy, largely due to the lack of decisive action from the Union. The Union would gain grounds and dissolve from those grounds in order to fight on another front or in another aspect of the conflict. And at this time, we also see a pretty big marker in the naval superiority aspect, with the Union naval superiority and what's the CSS Virginia, which is a big hunk of metal that the Confederacy thought would be indestructible, which takes down a few ships, but ultimately gets destroyed. Then we have the Battle of Stones River in 1862, from 1862 to 1863. In the short Battle of Stones River, the Union sees victory against a near equal opposing force. This is one of the many very essential victories to the North, and a much needed victory for the North. Artillery, battery organization, and support saves the Union line on multitudes of occasions throughout this conflict. Now we've got the Battle of Atlanta in 1864. The Battle of Atlanta resulted in a victory for the Union and a push and pull of power. So this is a front that we see a lot of deviation on the tactical advantages on both sides. However, it results in a win for the Union. This battle was a turning point for the Union, and it deemed a big evolution of tactics for the Union. Deviating away from the turn and retreat element. We have the Battle of Franklin at 1864, a large victory for the Union with a large loss of the Confederacy. Here we see decisive use of the repeater rifles and artillery and volley of fire to overpower the Confederates. This is one example that I'd like to highlight as the repeater rifle really saving a lot of detrimental turning points in this conflict. Antithesis and rebuttal. So some might argue that the primary factor in the eventual win for the Union is due to the personnel and the population numbers. However, for a force to successfully gain victory from sheer numbers, the small arms employment must be efficient and it must be advanced. And we see this in the beginning of the conflict, where the Union, they're not able to do much with their large numbers, and they're not able to do much with these technological advances, and they're not able to do much with their supplies because of this lack of proficient leadership. As the war continues on, we see a shift in the technologies and a shift of implementations of the technologies and a shift of tactics used by the North. The notable battles used in this presentation represent near equal forces that bout each other at the times. And each battle, evenly lined up with morale and leadership, comes down to a usage of terrain and implementation of the small arms in the said terrain. Once again, the capabilities and limitations of a force is always dependent upon the equipment that they can implement on the battlefield. So, influence and history of the firearms from 1675 to 1865. With this, planning and decisive action requires an understanding of the flow of capabilities and limitations of a force. The evolutions of small arms had a large effect on the stage of which the Civil War took place, and the advancements in weapon technology carried the Union through important lessons and important victories. That is all for my presentation. Here are the references. That is all, and I thank you very much.